right! Faster! We got Panzers at 11 o'clock! They're turning!
December 1944. The western edge of Germany's collapsing frontier. A Panzer crew peers through frost-clouded optics, scanning a hedgerow that has been quiet for hours. The ground is hard with cold. Engine noise hangs low in the air, familiar, heavy expected. Then something moves, too fast to be right. It does not crawl forward like a tank should. It darts. A gray silhouette flashes between trees, crossing open ground in seconds. No thick armor, no deliberate advance. Just speed. The turret snaps. A gun fires. Then the vehicle is already gone, reappearing from another angle, dust and snow thrown into the air behind it. The German commander hesitates. Training tells him this should not be possible. Enemy armor does not move like this. Not under fire. Not on frozen roads. Yet the radio crackles with reports from neighboring units. Targets appearing, vanishing, striking from unexpected directions. This is not a breakthrough led by mass. It is disruption led by motion. For the first time in the war, experienced panzer crews are not facing thicker steel or larger guns, but a battlefield where speed itself has become a weapon. And that shock did not arrive by accident. It was born from years of doctrine, failure, and reinvention that reshaped how the United States prepared to fight armored war in Europe. By the time German tank crews encountered American Hellcats racing across European battlefields, the armored war they thought they understood had already begun to collapse under its own weight. Germany entered the Second World War with a doctrine that reshaped modern combat. Blitzkrieg was not merely speed, it was coordination. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft moved together in carefully timed thrusts. In Poland in 1939, then France in 1940, panzer divisions advanced faster than opponents could react. German tank crews were trained to think offensively, to exploit gaps, to trust momentum. Armor did not win battles alone. It opened doors for everything that followed. But Blitzkrieg was designed for short wars. By 1941, in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union, that doctrine began to fray. Distances expanded. Supply lines stretched thin. Soviet resistance hardened. German tanks encountered enemies who absorbed punishment and returned it in greater numbers. By 1943, after Stalingrad and Kursk, the Panzer Arm was no longer an instrument of decisive movement. It had become a defensive shield, plugging gaps, counterattacking breakthroughs, bleeding slowly. German tank design reflected this shift. Early war Panzer IIIs and IVs emphasized balance. Later designs sacrificed speed for protection and firepower. The Panther carried a powerful 75mm gun and sloped armor meant to defeat Allied round at range. The Tiger embodied battlefield dominance through intimidation and armor thickness. These machines were lethal, but heavy. They demanded fuel, maintenance, and time. By 1944, time was something Germany no longer controlled. The Western Front reopened in June with the Allied landings in Normandy. German armored units rushed to contain the invasion, but the battlefield was no longer predictable. Air superiority denied daylight movement. Roads were cratered. Fuel shortages dictated when and where tanks could fight. Panzer crews learned to hide during the day and move at night, waiting for moments to strike. The enemy they faced was different from those of earlier years. The United States Army had not entered the war with a mature armor doctrine. In North Africa in 1942 and early 1943, American forces suffered painful defeats. German tanks outgunned them. German commanders outmaneuvered them. Reports from Kasserine Pass exposed weaknesses in training, leadership, and coordination. American tank crews were brave, but unprepared for experienced panzer veterans. The U.S. Army responded not with imitation, but separation. Rather than building tanks solely to fight tanks, American planners developed a distinct concept: tank destroyers. Tanks would support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. Tank destroyers would counter enemy armor. This was not theory born of confidence, but of fear. Fear that German armored mass assaults would overwhelm Allied positions in Europe. Exercises conducted in Louisiana and the Carolinas shaped this thinking. Enemy armor was expected to attack in waves. Tank destroyer units would rush to threatened sectors, maneuver aggressively, and destroy enemy tanks with speed and concentration of fire. Mobility mattered more than armor. Engagement choice mattered more than standing ground. This doctrine ran counter to German expectations. German tank crews were trained to respect enemy armor as a direct opponent. Tank versus tank combat was deliberate. Ranges were calculated. Armor thickness and gun penetration mattered. Speed was valuable, but survivability defined confidence. A panzer commander expected his vehicle to withstand punishment long enough to fight back. By late 1944, those expectations collided with a battlefield transformed by Allied production and adaptation. American industry flooded Europe with vehicles. Not all were heavily armored. Many were lightly protected, mechanically reliable, and fast. U.S. commanders emphasized flexibility. Units shifting rapidly, commanders encouraged to exploit opportunities rather than hold rigid lines. German intelligence noted these changes, but doctrine lagged behind reality. Reports described fast American vehicles, yet panzer crews still assumed that any armored threat would behave like a tank. Advance cautiously, seek hull-down positions, engage from range. What they did not anticipate was an enemy that would treat exposure as temporary and movement as survival. This disconnect between German expectation and American design set the stage for the shock to come. When Hellcats began appearing at the edges of panzer battles, they were not just new machines. They were the physical expression of a different way of thinking about armored war. And that way of thinking had been shaped deliberately long before the first Hellcat crossed into combat. The vehicle that would eventually unsettle German panzer crews was not conceived as a dueling machine. It was designed as a response to anxiety. In 1941, the United States Army faced a strategic problem it could not ignore. Intelligence estimates, often exaggerated, warned of mass German tank formations capable of breaking through Allied lines in Europe. American planners feared a repeat of France in 1940, but this time with U.S. forces on the receiving end. The solution they pursued was not heavier tanks, but a mobile reserve, units that could race to threatened sectors and blunt armored assaults before they could unfold. From this fear emerged the Tank Destroyer Command. Tank Destroyer doctrine emphasized speed, flexibility, and aggressive maneuver. Units were expected to seek out enemy armor, not wait for it. Vehicles were to sacrifice protection for mobility. Survivability would come from movement, surprise, and coordinated fire rather than armor thickness. This was a deliberate break from European armor tradition. Early tank destroyers were compromises. The M10 Wolverine mounted a powerful 3-inch gun, but was slow and awkward. The later M36 Jackson improved firepower with a 90mm gun, capable of defeating Panthers and Tigers, but it remained heavy. Neither fully embodied the doctrine's original vision. That vision was realized with the M18 Hellcat. The Hellcat was engineered around speed. Its Continental radial engine delivered exceptional power for its weight. Thin armor, often no more than an inch thick, kept mass low. The open-top turret reduced weight and improved visibility at the cost of crew protection. On roads, the Hellcat could exceed 50 miles per hour, faster than any armored fighting vehicle in the European theater. This was not an accident. Every design, choice reflected doctrine. The Hellcat was not meant to absorb hits. It was meant to choose when and where fights occurred, and to leave before the enemy could respond. Training reinforced this mindset. Hellcat crews were taught to use terrain aggressively, to fire from concealed positions, and to relocate immediately after engagement. Static defense was discouraged. Initiative was rewarded. Crews learned that hesitation was deadlier than exposure. By the time the Hellcat reached Europe in mid-1944, the battlefield was already changing. Normandy's hedgerows constrained movement, limiting the Hellcat's greatest advantage. But once Allied forces broke out in July, speed became decisive. American units surged across France, exploiting collapsing German lines. Roads opened. Distances mattered again. In this environment, the Hellcat thrived. German Panzer units, by contrast, were increasingly reactive. Fuel shortages limited training and maneuver. Replacement crews lacked the experience of earlier years. Heavy tanks excelled in defense, but struggled to reposition quickly. The Panther, formidable in a static engagement, was less forgiving under rapid movement and mechanical strain. When Hellcats entered combat against these units, the contrast was stark. German tankers expected enemy armor to advance methodically. Instead, they encountered vehicles that appeared suddenly on flanks, fired accurately, and vanished before return fire could be brought to bear. Engagements became disorienting. Traditional cues, engine noise, formation spacing, deliberate approach no longer applied. American commanders did not always use the Hellcat as doctrine intended. In practice, tank destroyer units were often attached to infantry divisions and used defensively. Yet even in these roles, the Hellcat's mobility allowed rapid repositioning along threatened fronts, particularly during fluid engagements. By late 1944, during the German Ardennes offensive, these qualities became critical. Roads clogged with retreating units and advancing columns alike. Visibility was poor. Decisions were made quickly, often with incomplete information. Units that could move faster than the enemy could think gained an edge. The Hellcat did not dominate the battlefield through armor or firepower alone. It disrupted expectations. German Panzer crews were forced to fight an enemy that refused to behave like a tank. In doing so, they confronted a deeper truth, that the war had shifted from contests of steel to contests of tempo. That realization would soon be tested under fire, from multiple perspectives, as speed began to reshape the human experience of armored combat on both sides. By 1944, the men inside German Panzers were veterans of a long war. Many had fought in Russia or Italy before being redeployed west. They understood armor thickness, gun penetration tables, and engagement ranges instinctively. Their confidence came from predictability. A tank battle followed rules. The Hellcat broke those rules. German after-action reports from late 1944 describe enemy vehicles that appeared suddenly and withdrew rapidly after firing. These were not isolated incidents. Panzer crews reported difficulty establishing firing solutions before targets vanished. In defensive positions, where German tanks relied on pre-sighted fields of fire, Hellcats refused to present stable targets. For a Panther commander trained to dominate open ground, this was deeply unsettling. The Panther's long-range gun was devastating, but only if it could be brought to bear. Turret traverse, optics, and crew coordination were designed for deliberate engagements. Against a fast-moving enemy that exploited dead ground and lateral movement, those strengths diminished. Psychologically, speed eroded confidence. A stationary tank is vulnerable, but a predictable one is manageable. The Hellcat was neither predictable nor stationary. German crews began to report a sense of being hunted rather than hunting. The battlefield felt unstable. Threats emerged from directions that planning had discounted. Inside the Hellcat, the experience was different, but no less tense. Crews knew their armor would not save them. Even small-caliber anti-tank guns could penetrate their hull. Artillery fragments and small arms fire could enter the open turret. Survival depended on awareness, coordination, and movement. This created a distinct combat mindset. Hellcat crews described fighting in short bursts. Accelerate, stop, fire, relocate. Engines remained running. Escape routes were planned before engagement. Crew discipline focused on speed of execution rather than endurance. Fear was constant, but so was agency. Unlike heavier tanks, Hellcat crews felt they controlled the engagement. They chose when to appear and when to disappear. Success reinforced confidence, but mistakes were unforgiving. One hit often meant destruction. At the tactical level, Hellcats forced German units to adjust under pressure. Panzer formations accustomed to anchoring defenses with heavy armor now faced threats to their flanks and rear. Infantry units struggled to track fast-moving vehicles across broken terrain. This shock was not just mechanical, it was cognitive. German commanders had to reconsider assumptions about enemy behavior while already under strain from air attacks, fuel shortages, and collapsing fronts. Decisions slowed. Coordination suffered. Speed, in this context, was not about chasing the enemy. It was about compressing the enemy's decision-making cycle. The Hellcat shortened the time German units had to react, turning hesitation into vulnerability. These effects multiplied across the front, setting conditions that went beyond individual encounters and began to influence how entire formations fought or failed to fight under pressure. On paper, the Hellcat should not have worked. German armored doctrine prized survivability. Tanks were expected to endure fire, maintain position, and dominate space. Armor thickness and gun power were tangible assurances. The Hellcat rejected this logic. Its armor could not withstand a direct hit from almost any German anti-tank weapon. Its open turret exposed crews to the elements and shrapnel. Technologically, it appeared fragile. Yet, doctrine gave that fragility meaning. The Hellcat's engine, suspension, and transmission were optimized for rapid acceleration and sustained speed. Its 76mm gun, while not always lethal frontally against Panthers or Tigers, was accurate and deadly from the flank. Paired with high-velocity ammunition, it rewarded maneuver over confrontation. German tanks were engineered for the last half of the fight, when contact was made and lines were fixed. The Hellcat was engineered for the moment before contact, when positioning decided outcomes. This difference revealed a growing gap between German technological excellence and the strategic reality they faced. American leadership at the unit level proved critical. Hellcat commanders were encouraged to exercise initiative within broad mission goals. This contrasted with German command structures increasingly strained by casualties and rigid orders. In fast-moving engagements, Hellcat platoon leaders made independent decisions, shifting positions, exploiting fleeting opportunities, disengaging without waiting for approval. German commanders, by contrast, often waited for coordination that never fully materialized. This asymmetry mattered. Speed amplified leadership quality. Where American officers trusted junior leaders, Hellcats became force multipliers. Where German units hesitated, gaps widened. Perhaps the most lasting effect of the Hellcat was psychological. German tank crews began to expect sudden contact. Tension increased. Movement slowed. Defensive positions became more cautious, sometimes overly so. Every hedgerow, forest edge, and road bend felt dangerous. For American crews, speed became identity. The Hellcat was not just a vehicle, it was a way of fighting. Crews spoke of outrunning danger, of surviving by refusing to linger. This mindset reinforced itself, shaping behavior even in units where doctrine was imperfectly applied. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by who had the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It was shaped by who could think and move faster under fire. These forces, technological divergence, leadership adaptation, and psychological pressure, were about to collide in specific battles where speed would no longer be an abstract advantage, but a decisive factor written into the outcome of combat itself. By the winter of 1944, the conditions that would test the Hellcat's purpose had fully converged. On December 16th, German forces launched their last major offensive in the West, the Ardennes attack. Dense forests, narrow roads, and poor weather neutralized Allied air power and compressed movement into choke points. German armored units, including experienced panzer formations, advanced with urgency born of desperation. For a brief moment, initiative shifted. American defenses bent, but they did not collapse. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with M18 Hellcats were rushed toward threatened sectors, often traveling through darkness and snow. Engines pushed hard. Roads clogged with refugees, retreating units, and supply vehicles. In this chaos, speed became more than advantage, it became access. Units that arrived first shaped the fight. Near Bastogne and along key road junctions, Hellcats were deployed in small, flexible elements. Rather than forming static lines, they moved between forest edges, villages, and open fields, seeking firing positions that offered concealment and escape routes. German armor advancing methodically found itself harassed from unexpected directions. One recurring pattern emerged. Hellcats would engage briefly, often at close range, striking vulnerable flanks. German return fire followed, but too late. The American vehicles were already moving, repositioning before artillery or heavier tanks could respond. In a confined Ardennes terrain, this tempo mattered. Panthers and Panzer IVs struggled to pivot, their movements constrained by trees and narrow roads. German crews accustomed to controlling engagements found themselves reacting instead. Similar dynamics unfolded earlier during the breakout from Normandy and later across the Rhineland. In open country, Hellcats exploited road networks to shift laterally faster than German units could redeploy. When German armor attempted counterattacks, Hellcat units appeared on exposed sides, disrupting formations before momentum could build. Specific engagements underscored the shift. During actions in eastern France in late summer 1944, Hellcat-equipped battalions reported high rates of vehicle survival when mobility was preserved. Losses mounted only when units were ordered to hold ground, contrary to doctrine. German after-action assessments increasingly noted difficulty in pinning down American tank destroyers. Heavy tanks were forced to operate more cautiously, often waiting for infantry support that slowed advances further. The cumulative effect was subtle but decisive. Hellcats did not annihilate German armor en masse. They interfered with timing. They delayed advances. They forced detours. In an offensive already constrained by logistics and weather, these disruptions compounded. By the end of December, German momentum in the Ardennes had stalled. While many factors contributed, supply shortages, stubborn infantry defense, eventual Allied air superiority, the presence of fast, elusive armored opposition played its role. The battlefield was reaching a moment where German commanders could no longer rely on weight and experience alone. They were being compelled to confront an enemy that would not stand still long enough to be destroyed. That confrontation would sharpen as German forces attempted to adapt, revealing both the limits of speed and the irreversible shift in how armored combat was being fought in the final months of the war. As German commanders recognized the pattern, they attempted to counter it. Orders emphasized tighter coordination between tanks and infantry. Reconnaissance units were pushed forward to screen flanks. Artillery observers were tasked with saturating suspected Hellcat routes. On paper, these measures were sound. In practice, they collided with reality. Fuel shortages limited maneuver. Communications were unreliable. Replacement crews lacked the experience to execute complex countertactics under pressure. Heavy tanks could not rapidly redeploy once committed. Each adjustment came too late to restore initiative. In several engagements during January and February 1945, German units attempted to draw Hellcats into frontal confrontations. The results were uneven. When Hellcats were forced to fight head-on or hold static positions, losses were severe. German guns proved deadly. The Hellcats' limits were exposed without ambiguity. But these moments did not define the larger pattern. American commanders learned quickly. Orders shifted. Hellcats were increasingly used as mobile screens, flank guards, and rapid response units rather than line-holding assets. They struck and withdrew, leaving heavier American tanks and infantry to consolidate ground. During the Allied advance into central Germany, this coordination reached maturity. Hellcats ranged ahead of main forces, probing for resistance, delaying counterattacks, and forcing German units to reveal positions. German armor, already short on fuel and ammunition, was compelled to react repeatedly, expending scarce resources for diminishing returns. The psychological burden intensified. German crews reported constant alerts, interrupted maintenance, and exhaustion from false contacts and fleeting engagements. The battlefield never settled. There was no stable front where experience could reassert control. By March 1945, the pattern was clear. Speed had not replaced armor. It had undermined it. German heavy tanks remained lethal, but their ability to dictate the terms of battle was gone. The decisive moment was not a single engagement, but a realization shared across units that the war of movement had shifted irreversibly. The side that could reposition faster, decide faster, and disengage faster now shaped outcomes. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine, German armored resistance fractured. Hellcats did not lead the crossings, but they ensured German counterattacks arrived late, disorganized, or not at all. The stunned reaction of panzer crews was no longer surprise. It was resignation. They were fighting a war where their strengths were no longer decisive, and where adaptation came too slowly to matter. With Germany's armored force broken in function, if not in courage, the consequences of this shift began to unfold across the collapsing front, shaping the final months of the war and the reckoning that followed. The Ardennes, the Rhineland, and the push into central Germany revealed the practical results of Hellcat employment. Losses, both material and psychological, were documented meticulously by German units and later analyzed by Allied intelligence. Panthers and Panzer IVs remained potent, but their effectiveness was diminished by a combination of tactical disruption, fuel scarcity, and relentless mobility from American forces. Reports from German panzer divisions described engagements where Hellcats appeared as if from nowhere, struck vulnerable flanks, and disappeared before coordinated counterfire could be delivered. Entire columns were forced to halt, regroup, or reroute, often delaying advances by hours or days. These disruptions compounded logistical challenges already aggravated by winter weather and Allied air interdiction. From the American perspective, Hellcats fulfilled the doctrinal expectation of mobility over armor. Units reported high survival rates when crews adhered to doctrine, engaged briefly, reposition, and maintain initiative. Tank destroyer battalions that followed this principle contributed to delaying or halting German armored thrusts without engaging in costly head-to-head confrontations. Casualty reports indicated that the Hellcats' speed minimized exposure to artillery and tank fire, while their 76mm gun, used from advantageous positions, inflicted measurable attrition on German forces. The psychological impact on both sides was measurable. German commanders, once confident in the dominance of armored formations, increasingly documented fatigue, disorientation, and a sense of unpredictability caused by these fast-moving vehicles. Officers noted that crews hesitated, movements slowed, and defensive positions became overcautious. Conversely, American units reported elevated morale tied to the sense of control provided by maneuverable vehicles. Crews described engagement not as a test of endurance, but as a contest of timing, positioning, and speed. Strategically, the Hellcats' presence shaped operational decisions. German high command, already constrained by fuel shortages and fragmented communication, could not mass armor effectively without incurring risk. Orders increasingly emphasized defensive posturing and conserving resources rather than pursuing decisive armored counterattacks. In this environment, the Hellcats' mobility amplified its influence, allowing smaller American elements to hold larger forces at bay temporarily and shape the battlefield in ways that outpaced German capacity to respond. The cumulative effect of these engagements confirmed the practical success of the tank destroyer doctrine. While not achieving total battlefield dominance through armor penetration, Hellcats disrupted enemy formations, forced reactive maneuvers, and altered the tempo of armored warfare on the Western Front. German reports consistently acknowledged that engagements with these vehicles were particularly frustrating, not because of firepower alone, but because of unpredictability, mobility, and the compounding effect of constant repositioning. These operational results set the stage for the strategic consequences that would unfold as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, encountering increasingly desperate but ultimately ineffective resistance from German armored formations. As Allied forces pressed into the heart of Germany in early 1945, the strategic consequences of Hellcat operations became increasingly clear. German armored units, though still formidable on paper, were operationally fragmented. Fuel shortages, attrition, and the constant threat of mobile American counterattacks prevented the coordination required for effective counteroffensives. Hellcats, by their speed and unpredictability, exacerbated these challenges, ensuring that German armor could rarely achieve local superiority. After-action reports from the U.S. Army highlighted several trends. First, the Hellcats' ability to exploit open terrain and road networks allowed rapid response to emerging threats, often arriving before German commanders could reposition their units. Second, the psychological effect of an elusive, mobile opponent forced German crews to adopt defensive postures, slowing advances and reducing initiative. Third, even when Hellcats were outmatched in firepower by Panthers or Tigers, their tactical mobility enabled them to engage selectively, strike flanks, and withdraw safely, preserving combat strength over prolonged operations. German assessments noted that these encounters revealed a mismatch between doctrine and reality. Panzer crews had been trained to dominate through superior armor and firepower, assuming that engagements would be deliberate and predictable. Against Hellcats, however, the dynamic changed. The armored duel was replaced by a cat-and-mouse game where speed dictated outcomes. Even experienced commanders found themselves outmaneuvered, forced to react rather than initiate. Strategically, this shift contributed to the collapse of German armored resistance during the final months of the war. As U.S. forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into central Germany, German tank formations were increasingly confined to static or reactive positions. Large-scale counterattacks, previously the hallmark of armored doctrine, became rare or ineffective. Supply lines and communication difficulties amplified the impact of Hellcat harassment, turning operational advantages into tactical frustrations. Post-war analyses confirmed these observations. U.S. Army reports emphasized that the Hellcat's design, mobility over armor, was ideal for the operational environment in late 1944 to 45, fluid fronts, constrained supply, and a numerically inferior but agile opponent. German military historians acknowledged that the psychological effect of the tank destroyer, combined with its practical mobility, created conditions in which even elite armored units could be neutralized without direct confrontation. Yet, the aftermath also highlighted the limits of the Hellcat concept. While effective as a tactical disruptor and flank attacker, the vehicle could not replace heavy tanks for sustained offensives or breakthrough operations. Its open-top design and thin armor made prolonged engagements highly risky, and its firepower, though sufficient against medium German tanks, was inadequate against heavily armored Tigers frontally. In essence, the Hellcat excelled by exploiting speed and initiative rather than raw combat power. By the spring of 1945, the cumulative effect was undeniable. German armored doctrine, once decisive on the battlefield, had been disrupted not solely by material superiority, but by a combination of maneuver, speed, and psychological pressure. The battlefield now favored those who could think and move faster, adapting instantly to emerging threats, a reality epitomized by the M18 Hellcat's brief but decisive role in the final months of the European conflict. The story of the Hellcat is not one of invincibility, nor of overwhelming firepower. It is a story of adaptation, how speed, initiative, and doctrine can reshape a battlefield long dominated by steel and armor. In the final months of the European war, German Panzer crews confronted an enemy that refused to fight by established rules, and in doing so, discovered the limits of their own experience. The M18 Hellcat demonstrated that warfare is not defined solely by the thickness of a tank's armor or the caliber of its gun, but by the tempo at which decisions are made and executed. Its crews relied on judgment, coordination, and rapid movement to survive, and to influence the outcome of battles far larger than the vehicles themselves. It was a reminder that technology alone does not win wars. Human understanding of its strengths, applied with discipline and imagination, can shift the balance. For the soldiers on both sides, the encounter was deeply human. German tankers felt the unsettling pressure of an invisible threat, forcing them to question assumptions built over years of training. American crews discovered the tension and exhilaration of controlling engagements through motion and timing. Across the snow-choked roads and shattered villages of late-war Europe, the war became a contest not just of steel and fire, but of cognition and courage under pressure. In the broader sweep of history, the Hellcat episode foreshadowed modern armored warfare. Mobility, rapid redeployment, and psychological impact would remain as decisive as raw firepower. It revealed that a smaller, lighter, and faster vehicle, when employed with skill and doctrine, could challenge even the most heavily armored and battle-hardened opponent. Ultimately, the stunned reactions of Panzer crews were more than surprise. They were a revelation. Speed had become a weapon, and in that revelation, the war's final lessons were quietly, decisively written into the terrain of armored combat.